Chapter 10. As Pat Stevens backed away from the log cabin, he supported the limp body of Helen Higgins with his uninjured arm, while he held his commanding 6-gun tight against his side with his right hand. His arm and chest were a flaming mess of pain, but the terrible necessity of the situation kept him on his feet, moving slowly backwards to the corral. He had only get Helen out of the hands of the gang. That was the only thing that mattered now. Through a horrible series of mistakes, he was responsible for her presence in the gang's hideout. The lantern hanging outside the cabin lit the door clearly, and when Pat and the girl were less than 50 feet away, he saw it swinging open, a curious crack. He pressed the trigger of his gun and was grimly surprised to see a bullet knock a wooden splinter from the edge of the door. He could still shoot, by God, wounded and shaky as he was. The men inside the cabin jerked the doors shut when his bullet showed them that he was still in command of the situation outside. The echoes of the single shot were still racketing back and forth between the sheer walls of the gulch when Helen stirred in the circle of his left arm. He continued to back away from the cabin slowly, counseling the girl. "Take it easy now. Everything's going to be all right if you leave it to me."
"If I leave it to you?"
Helen's voice held biting scorn.
"I'd be safer inside with all those men than outside here alone with you."
"That's where you're making a bad mistake," Pat told her quietly. "If you'll help me get a couple horses saddled."
"Help you?"
She shrank away from him again, suddenly began wringing and twisting to be free.
"After you killed my father?"
Pat's left arm held her like an encircling iron band, and he spoke harshly to jar her out of the impending hysteria. "Haven't you figured it out yet that I couldn't have killed your dad? It was a good hour's ride to this cabin from your ranch. How the devil do you think I carried him here, and then got back to the ranch for you to shoot me 15 minutes after he went out and got shot?" He shook her violently. "Get it through your head. I didn't kill Mose Higgins."
"That's right," she said wonderingly. "It is a good hour's ride to this cabin, then. You couldn't have done it. Perhaps you were telling the truth all the time, but those men think so too, though. They took you away from Clarence by force to save you from going to jail. You're one of the gang that was after Dad."
"Sure, that's what they think. You and that Clarence told them so, didn't you? Remember back what had happened. They knew someone was going after Mose tonight. They didn't know who. But when we came riding along and you and Clarence spilled your story, well, they figured I was the guy that they were expecting." They were at the bars of the corral now. A wave of weakness assailed Pat. His left arm sliding away from the girl's waist, he groped at the corral fence for support and got hold of a rail and clung to it desperately, while he kept his gaze glued upon the front door of the cabin, his gun leveled and ready to fire at the slightest indication of action from them that were cooped up inside. Helen stepped away from him. She hesitated, poised on the verge of flight, looking him up and down queerly. There was something splendid and pathetic and something tragically glorious in the sight of his tall body sagging with pain and the loss of blood. Yet, standing alone there against those inside the cabin to cover the escape. Helen hesitated only an instant before something happened to her in the vicinity of her heart. She felt a great flooding sensation of relief, of newborn hope. For the first time, she had been queerly drawn to this tall, quiet stranger and had forced herself to fight against the feeling. She was ceasing fighting now. Perhaps he was telling the truth. She desperately needed to believe in something, in someone. She moved close to Pat, and there was a strange radiance on her face which could not even shadow cast by the canyon wall could hide. Her voice was husky with emotion as she pressed against him. "I've got to believe you. I'm going to make myself believe you if you want to put your arm around me again." Her voice was an invitation, and Pat turned his head and saw that her young lips were parting very close to his. He set his teeth against tightly and turned back to keep watch on the cabin door. He continued to hold himself erect with his left hand gripping at the fence rail. Don't, he told her gently. I want you to get out of this mess in one piece. Don't forget, there's young Clarence waiting for you back in town. It was funny. Pat was thinking in a queer, impersonal way how death and love were always so mingled together. He had seen it happen so often in the past, passion blazing in the face of danger. He didn't realize it. It was a demand of nature upon the human race to seize the last moment of living for love before it was too late. All he knew was that, if he wasn't a merry man, if Sally and Doc weren't waiting for him back in Powder Valley, he'd have forgotten everything else and put his arms around that there girl. It didn't matter that he was older than she. Nothing mattered except... But there was Sally back there in Powder Valley. Helen waited, pressed close to him, her quivering young bosom warm against his body. She didn't understand it any more than Pat did. All she knew was that she wanted desperately to make up to him for what had happened tonight. The flame died in her breast for a moment, while Pat remained turned away. She drew in a great shuddering breath and asked him quietly,
What do you want me to do?
Can you make out to saddle a couple of horses while I keep an eye peeled on that door to see the varmints don't be getting out?
I think so. I'll try.
Helen moved away, walking firmly to the corral gate. She was hell of a fine girl, Pat thought to himself. Make some man a wonderful wife. Clarence, though? He let go of the fence with his left hand to wipe sweat from his face. No, he was pretty sure it wouldn't be Clarence, and he felt strangely relieved. Somehow he didn't like the thought of her being married to Clarence. It seemed to him that the cabin door moved kind of slightly. Might be a trick of his vision. He wasn't seeing very clearly. He fired at the door again just for good luck. Might as well let them know he was still out there. What about the guard that was stationed down there on the creek? It was funny. He didn't come up to see what the shooting was, but maybe he was used to a few stray shots from the gang. Maybe he had strict orders not to leave his post no matter what happened. Damn that guard anyway. If it wasn't for him, Pat could have stayed here and covered the cabin door while the girl rode off for safely. As it was, Pat figured their best chance would be to mount 2 horses and make a break for it together. He could ride in the lead and shoot it out with the guard, and make the girl follow a little behind him. He heard Helen in the corral behind him. The horses were circling the enclosure, snorting and terrified. She would have to rope them out. No mean feat for an experienced roper in the darkness and with a bunch of strange horses. She was a girl in a million. He could hear her talking soothingly to one horse, leading him towards the corral gate. His body sagged lower and lower against the fence despite his best efforts to hold himself upright. He wondered vaguely how bad he was shot. He'd never quite felt this weak before. He had to hang on. For a little time, anyway, if he could just get enough strength to sit in the saddle. He heard Helen roping out another horse. He hoped she'd be able to pick out his roan for him. He was used to that horse. It'd be easier to stay in the saddle with a familiar gait underneath him. He concentrated all of his strength on staying erect and keeping his watch on that front door of the log cabin. He and the girl wouldn't have a chance to escape unless he kept Harry and the others cooped up inside until they got away. Helen was getting the second horse saddled now. Pat hoped to God that he'd have enough strength to get in the saddle and stay there until the guard was disposed of. He heard Helen opening the corral gate and leading the horses out. The men in the cabin were showing no further desire to open the door in the face of his bullets. He turned to see the faint outline of Helen's smiling face beside him.
I managed to get your horse and I think your own saddle. How are you feeling?
Pretty good for the shape I'm in. Pat let go of the corral fence and felt himself getting ready to crumble. He took hold of the shoulders of the girl and leaned against her. She competently maneuvered his roan around so the left stirrup was right in front of him. Pat Stevens put everything he had into the job of getting into the saddle. The roan was patient and let him flounder upwards with Helen helping with all of her strength. When Pat got both feet into the stirrups and his hand on the saddle horn, he felt able to accomplish anything. Then Helen mounted swiftly beside him. "We'll take it slow and easy as we can," Pat whispered hoarsely. "If they don't hear us riding away, they may think I'm still here watching and won't try to open the door." Helen nodded without speaking. They rode past the cabin at a slow walk, and it seemed to Pat that he could hear the loud pounding of Helen's heart, but it might have been his own. He kept his gaze fixed upon the cabin, his gun ready to throw lead, but nothing happened. The cabin became smaller in the distance behind them. The lantern was only a faint yellow glow in the night, and when they were too far away for accurate shooting, Pat spurred his roan into a trot and seeking to draw a little ahead of the girl. He didn't know how far down the creek the guard had been stationed, and he planned to be enough in the lead to take the first bullets if there was going to be shooting. But Helen immediately spurred up alongside him. "If there was only some way of getting over to the side of the canyon, we'd be all right. Our ranch isn't more than a quarter mile from that cabin as the crow flies." "Well, it's too bad that we ain't crows," Pat grunted. He shook his head at the forbidden walls on either side of them. "The only way out is down as far as I can figure." "How far away do you think the guard is?" "We don't have no way of knowing," Pat told her grimly. "All we can do is keep riding until we get stopped." He had a death grip on the saddle horn to hold himself in the saddle. He had wrenched his wounds, and mounting he could feel them bleeding profusely again. "At least," he muttered, "they haven't found out that we're gone and started after us, but they're sure to do it as soon as the shooting starts down this way." Again he tried to put distance between his horse and Helen's, but the fool girl stayed beside him like a leech. "Before it's too late," she told him swiftly, "I want you to know that—" Pat heard a horse nicker on up ahead of them in the canyon. It was cut off suddenly, as though an alert watcher had suddenly grabbed the animal's nostrils. He drove his spurs into the roan's flanks, sending him lunging away from Helen. A voice shouted, and flames stabbed at him from the darkness ahead, and he replied with his own 6-gun. The guard was firing with both hands. Pat's gun was suddenly empty. He hadn't the time nor the strength to reload. He drove the roan savagely at the splitting lances of flame in front, and he felt the horse stagger beneath them. But the roan recovered and didn't slacken in speed. He heard the man scream in terror and try to leap backwards, but it was too late to escape the roan's flailing forefeet. Pat's body went hurtling through space as the roan stumbled and went down. He lit on his left side with an impact that drove the breath from his body, and dazedly he realized that Helen was galloping up and threw herself from the saddle. She was leaning over him, sobbing. Her tears were like splatters of molten metal upon his cheek, and he tried to push her away. "Go on, get out of here fast," he muttered. "You'll be all right if you hurry, but the others, they'll be coming up behind." "I can't leave you here. I can't." "It's the only thing you can do," Pat argued. "I'm done for now. I won't make her. That guard, he won't bother you. Just get on your horse and get going." "No." She jumped up, looked about her wildly. Pat watched her run to the side of his roan, who was laying with his neck crumpled underneath him, and she was tugging on the saddle. Then she stepped back, and he saw that she was pulling his carbine from the saddle boot. She ran to her horse and leapt into the saddle. A wave of gladness swept over Pat. Everything was all right. She was going to be sensible. She still had plenty of time to escape. But his eyes were playing tricks on him again. She wasn't escaping. It looked like she was riding back towards the cabin. That's what she was doing. She was riding back with his bolt-action saddle gun balanced across the pommel of her saddle. He tried to lift his voice to yell at her, but he was all choked up. He couldn't utter a word. Faintly, from back in the direction in which Helen was riding, he heard the rattling of sporadic firing, and then he didn't hear nothing else. End of chapter 10.